Today at the National Press Club, Labor leader Anthony Albanese. Listening to the experts has served Australia well during the pandemic. Mr Albanese says it's time science had a bigger role in all areas of policy making. That's today at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac Address. My name is Sabra Lane. I'm the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. Today's guest is the federal Labor leader, Anthony Albanese. If you're following the conversation online, you'll find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAUST. Everybody, please join me in welcoming Anthony Albanese.
Well, thank you very much. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Can I acknowledge my Deputy, Richard Marles, my Shadow Science Minister, Brendan O'Connor, David Smith, Andrew Lee and Alicia Payne, part of the ACT crew in the National Parliament, and of course the Chief Minister, Andrew Barr. Ladies and gentlemen, one and all. One day, when the pandemic is over, we might get back into the habit of carrying cash around in our wallets. Although cash is likely to be used substantially less than before the pandemic. Those plastic banknotes are a double boon. They're harder to forge than the old paper ones, and they can survive a washing machine. This practical bit of genius is an Australian invention, one of many to have emerged out of the CSIRO. That great powerhouse of turning imagination and curiosity into reality. Fittingly, one of those banknotes bears the face of David Unaipon, preacher, proud Indigenous Australian, inventor and scientific thinker. He revolutionised sheep shearing. He foresaw the development of laser. Decades before the first chopper took to the sky, he developed a concept of a helicopter based on the aerodynamics of the boomerang. If we dedicated all our banknotes to our inventors and our discoverers, there's a pretty good competition. Nobel laureate and molecular biologist Elizabeth Blackburn, 2018 Australian of the Year and quantum physicist Michelle Simmons, Howard Florey, of course, who carried out the first clinical tests of penicillin, Fiona Wood, who invented spray-on skin and transformed burns treatment, Graham Clark, who gave hearing back to so many with the multi-channel cochlear implant. What unites them all is curiosity and a vision of a better way of doing things. Today I want to talk about how that spirit can take us forward. For years, science has been taking a pounding, and that perversity that we call the culture wars. A pandemic has snapped us back to reality. COVID-19 has reunited us with our respect for science. And with that has come an understanding that science is what can take us from lockdown to unlocking our potential. And as we get better at converting that hunger for knowledge into dollars, science will be at the core of our future economic growth, our new industries and the jobs they will create. What we have is nothing short of a chance to make a better Australia powered by science. Contrary to some commentary, we actually have a high level of trust in science. When it comes to agreeing with the claim that science benefits us, a study by Gallup puts Australia among the top 5 nations in the world. Australians are resourceful and famously ingenious. We have a proud record of invention. To the Australian breakthroughs I've already mentioned add cervical cancer vaccines, gene shears, the Hendra virus vaccine, the black box flight recorder, Aerogard, and here on Evidence Today, wine bottle screw caps. And yet, paradoxically, we don't celebrate these achievements enough. We keep adding to its pages, but science is not a story that we're good at telling. In Western Australia, construction will soon begin on a major section of the Square Kilometre Array Radio Telescope, Along with its companion section in South Africa, it will let us scan the sky 10,000 times faster than we have ever been able to before. Each of the 2 supercomputers which will process data from the SKA will be among the largest in the world. The SKA will be used by astrobiologists to search for amino acids by identifying their spectral signatures. Amino acids are the very basis of life. Locating these biomarkers will give us our best chance of finding life elsewhere in the universe. We will not know what that life is or whether it's intelligent. And we will be looking at light that was emitted literally thousands of years ago. Yet if it happens, this will be one of the most profound moments in human history. And it would happen right here in Australia. But have we heard a lot about it? We just don't have that culture of excitement about science that you'll find in countries like the United States, Germany or China. We need to lift the standard of the national conversation. Respect for science should be a given, but many scientists are simply exhausted from being derided by quacks and conspiracists. Some of those are in Parliament. There's no shortage of politicians who tell us they don't believe in the science of climate change. But science is not an act of faith. Climate change is no more a matter of belief than the coronavirus is. It's about heeding the evidence, and it's overwhelming. We cannot allow opinion to trump truth. It ranges all the way from Liberal Senator Gerard Rennick, who thinks the Bureau of Meteorology is part of a global conspiracy, to Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, who viewed discussing the role of climate change in our catastrophic bushfire season as, and I quote, the ravings of some pure, enlightened and woke capital city greenies. Mention the Enlightenment to these people and they reach for the dimmer switch. It's embarrassing, but not surprising. When it comes to listening to science, this government has been conveniently ignorant. It will be easy to attribute this to mere incompetence, but that would be wrong. This is no accident. In its very first budget in 2014, the government stripped $110 million out of scientific funding and hollowed out the CSIRO, one of the bodies we are now counting on for a COVID-19 vaccine. Today, at the very time I'm giving a speech praising the CSIRO, they are about to announce the loss of 40 jobs at the CSIRO, particularly dealing with energy policy. Funding for our only dedicated bushfire research centre runs out in June, and it won't be renewed. For this government, back in black means turning off the lights. The pandemic has been a wake-up call. The government has begrudgingly shelved ideology in favour of expertise. We all came together as a nation. The values that are seeing us through this crisis are the values that will let us flourish when it is behind us. We're not there yet. COVID-19 is still ravaging many countries, and the spectre of a second wave keeps us grounded. Australia has been fortunate. Some of it has been the lottery of geographical isolation and low population density. But it is also thanks to our high level of scientific and medical expertise, and crucially, the fact that it was listened to and acted upon. It has also been a victory for the Australian people. It's testament to our instincts to pull together and cooperate, and to respect actual experts rather than the instant experts who spring up on Facebook like mushrooms and thrive on the same fuel. As the race to develop a vaccine goes on, earlier scientific achievements have helped life to continue, not least as Wi-Fi, which grew partly out of the CSIRO's work in radio astronomy. Wi-Fi has played a major role in flattening the curve. It's let us work from home. It safeguarded our physical and mental health. It helped us to stay connected with each other even as we were physically separated. It let us shop and access medical services from the safety of home. The pandemic has accelerated our thinking about how the internet can loosen the binds of habit and improve how we work and how we live. Imagine a faster, more reliable NBN. It would allow us to spread out, taking pressure off our big cities, giving regional cities and towns a fresh boost, and improving our quality of life. The use of smart infrastructure has consistently produced double-digit benefit cost ratios and should be an essential component of new infrastructure. We can be proud of what we've achieved so far. Compared with so many other countries, especially where the response has been more political than scientific, we're relatively better off. We can begin picturing what a post-pandemic Australia can look like. Labor is doing what we always do, looking to the future with clear eyes, open minds and with optimism. Consider two Labor leaders who faced another of our nation's turning points. With the world in conflict around them, John Curtin and Ben Chifley spoke not just of victory in war, but of victory in peace. Curtin didn't live to see the peace, but Chifley worked his guts out for that second victory. Among his priorities were enlarging the CSIRO and establishing the Australian National University right here in the national capital. As Chifley said, and I quote, "Scientific research is a necessity for the maintenance of our standard of living and even for our survival." The pandemic has brought that truth even more sharply into focus. So as we contemplate the road ahead, we must not assume that we've had our pandemic moment. We've been warned that COVID-19 might not even be the big one that we face in our lifetime. Now is not the time for complacency. For one thing, should we be the only OECD nation without the equivalent of a Centre for Disease Control and Prevention. A properly resourced, independent Australian CDC would ensure a standing focus on pandemic preparedness, such as regular drills and exercises. The last one to take place in this country was Exercise Sustain in 2008 under the Rudd government. A CDC could provide governments with consistent, rapid advice and coordinate medical research across the public and private sectors, as well as manage the national medical stockpile. We should also consider the health architecture of our region. Perhaps one way of revitalising APEC is to have an APEC CDC providing advice to member economies. Then, of course, there's the World Health Organization, which has come in for much criticism, some of it justified. We must ensure that criticism of the WHO is constructive and not just the latest volley in the culture wars about negative globalism. The WHO should be strengthened and made more transparent and accountable, not sidelined. After all, it was the World Health Organization that persuaded the Soviet Union and the United States to work together at the height of the Cold War to eradicate smallpox. It's this level of ambition that is needed to improve the global response to the pandemic, including on the crucial task of discovering and distributing a vaccine. Even as we flatten the curve of the coronavirus, the curve of climate change is waiting for us. Returning to our pre-pandemic approach is not an option. Consider this government's rejection of fire experts who are predicting exactly what was coming and begging to be heard before the recent catastrophic bushfire season. There was no listening, there was no respect, but there was catastrophic bushfires. Meanwhile, droughts are going worse and temperature records are being broken in an unrelenting procession. But we don't have to be passive. Guided by science, we can fight climate change and create jobs at the same time. We can have a future as a renewable energy superpower with all of the environmental as well as the economic benefits. With our rich lithium reserves, we're edging closer to the development of a battery manufacturing industry here in Australia. Brisbane-based company Tritium has developed the world's fastest charging stations and is fuelling the shift to electric vehicles in Europe and the USA. Among the energy opportunities that science is bringing within our reach, Chief Scientist Alan Finkel sees a hydrogen export industry that in just 10 years could be worth $1.7 billion. There are so many opportunities, but as Labor understands instinctively, you can only get the policy settings right when you listen to and respect the science. That's why we've always supported renewable energy. It's cheap, it's clean, it is the future. Even the government now admits as much in their technology roadmap. There are elements of the roadmap, such as using domestic nuclear power, that Labor remains opposed to. But Labor welcomes the newfound acceptance that renewables and other clean technologies are not only the key to addressing climate change, but also key to more investment and more jobs. But a technology roadmap isn't an energy policy. It doesn't tell us how to get there, just where we're going. We need an energy policy that will support the investment required to deliver on the technology roadmap's promise. Labor knows this. Business knows this. Investors and energy market agencies know this. Energy policy paralysis and uncertainty has been a major contributor to the decline in business investment. It has resulted in higher costs for business. Removing this handbrake must be an important part of facilitating the economic recovery that is needed, given we are in the first recession for 3 decades. When the Morrison government abandoned the National Energy Guarantee, they turned their back for a time on the prospect of an enduring bipartisan energy policy. Today, with the importance of scientific advice being front and centre, as well as a need to invest in and create jobs, it is beyond time that Australia had an energy policy in the national interest. That's why I've written to the Prime Minister and suggested we meet and agree on an energy investment framework that will deliver the modernisation of our energy system. Like industry and the experts, Labor is open-minded about the specific investment framework to be adopted. We can work with the National Energy Guarantee, a clean energy target, an emissions intensity scheme, or other models which deliver the essential component of providing that investment certainty. It must be flexible and it must be enduring. An enduring energy policy is one that can adjust to different emissions targets. It should be possible to agree on a policy framework that can deliver confidence to investors, even though there is disagreement over Labor's net zero emissions by 2050 target. Labor is willing to support carbon capture and storage technologies being able to generate carbon offsets as long as the usual quality safeguards are met. We would also support the government if it reinstates the CCS flagships program that was established by Labor with $1.7 billion of funding and abolished by the Abbott government, or, if the government prefers, a new funding vehicle. The Chief Scientists, the IPCC and the International Energy Agency all advise that CCS must be part of the solution to reach net zero emissions. But we won't agree that renewable energy agencies like ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation should have their funds for renewables raided in order to invest in carbon capture technology. If we are to advance the technology roadmap, then ARENA must be supported with further funding. When the science is clear, the political class should act. Action on climate change that provides investment certainty will create jobs, lower energy costs and reduce emissions. For Labor, the road ahead has always been clear. At the economic summit that followed the Hawke government's election, the communique singled out new technology as a key driver of economic growth. It's a vision that has gone missing in more recent years. The pandemic has shown up our economy as being short on resilience. The cautionary tale of Australia's car industry is emblematic. This government withdrew co-investment funding and dared them to leave, an invitation that car makers took up. This act of self-harm knocked us down the technological pole and further narrowed an economic base that is now too reliant on services and the export of raw materials. We're making ourselves vulnerable to a decline in living standards. And when the next crisis severs global supply lines, we'll be exposed. But this is our chance to start turning things around. The future belongs to those countries that innovate, that adapt and that adjust. When it comes to repairing and building that economy, technology and innovation will be the key to boosting productivity, growing local manufacturing and achieving self-reliance. Encouragingly, some of our homegrown firms are already at the forefront of science and technology. Biotech firm CSL, a product of the Hawke-Keating microeconomic reforms of the 1980s, is now Australia's largest company by market capitalisation and is working with the University of Queensland to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Just earlier this month, software giant Atlassian played a major role in the SpaceX rocket launch that took 2 US astronauts to the International Space Station. Our resource and agricultural producers are at the helm of the development, design and application of artificial intelligence, drone technologies, as well as genetics. And our building and construction sector continues to advance with new products, including environmentally sustainable materials and software that improve design, project management and ultimately our urban environments. We must strengthen our capacity to create. We must become serious about high-tech manufacturing. While the responsibility doesn't rest solely with them, our public institutions, including the CSIRO and our universities, are responsible either directly or indirectly for many of the innovations that we take for granted today. But the Morrison government plans to cut the research and development tax incentive, which is designed to encourage innovation and growth. And that innovation, which would bolster industries, create jobs and improve quality of life, can take so many forms, from improving our manufacturing capability to accelerating the evolution of transport from electric vehicles to freight data hubs to intelligent transport systems. But our R&D investment has fallen below 2% of GDP, below countries like South Korea, Israel, Sweden, Denmark and Singapore. Unless we invest in R&D, we will only be able to read the story of our proud manufacturing history, when what we should be doing is writing the next chapter. If only we could persuade this government that R&D was the name of a sports club in a marginal electorate. The Reserve Bank Governor says that we need to be building bridges across to our recovery, but with these cuts, the governor's burning them. Our ranking on the Harvard University Economic Complexity Index, which measures the ability to produce unique products, has gone from 55 in 1995 to 87 in 2017. The government needs a comprehensive plan to create a supply of STEM workers, which is undermined by contracting out at the CSIRO and cuts to R&D tax incentives. The best practice countries are the ones that drive innovation more directly, focusing their national research efforts into areas of comparative advantage or national missions. This was the essential point of the Ferris Review into Innovation, which was commissioned by Malcolm Turnbull but now lies dormant. Perhaps the best known model of how government can leverage research and innovation comes from the United States and its long-standing Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. DARPA's success is quite remarkable given its size and budget, having assisted in developing innovations that our modern economy depends on, such as the internet, GPS and drone aerial technology. We also need a more sophisticated manufacturing plan than just responding when a crisis is on. We could do much better at commercialising research, thereby building industries and jobs at home and then selling the product that they produce to the world. Our failure reduces revenue and intellectual property. It affects investment, entrepreneurship and technological growth. Labor has backed calls from the tech sector for the R&D tax incentive refunds to be paid early. As part of our desire to partner with the private sector, a future Labor government would encourage the superannuation industry to invest in infrastructure, technology and R&D in a way that is consistent with members' interests. It would pay for all of us well into the future. The government is content to come up with roadmap after roadmap, but they never put any fuel in the car. Take artificial intelligence. In 2018 alone, AI contributed an estimate US $2 trillion to the global economy. But within a decade, that figure is forecasted to reach nearly $16 trillion, an 8-fold increase in 10 years. As PwC puts it, this would make it, quote, the biggest commercial opportunity in today's fast-changing economy. In the 2018 budget, the government announced it was allocating $30 million over 4 years to support the development of AI. But Singapore is devoting 5 times that amount. At the last election, Labor championed the establishment of a National Centre of AI Excellence. It would help chart the likely national investment required in this area by bringing together those with a stake in the effect of AI's application in our economy. This centre needs to be established now. We have the talent and the brain power in this country, but not the ability to hang on to it. In contrast to the UK, which has boosted spending on PhD candidates working on AI, it's just not something that Australia has prioritised enough. The demise starts early. The number of Australian school students studying science has been dwindling for decades. Our international results are falling, and there are not enough jobs waiting for them at the other end. Fewer than 10% of Australian university graduates complete an engineering degree, compared to 20% in Germany and the same figure in Korea. Only 16% of Australians qualified in STEM are women. Last week's higher education announcement here at the Press Club will leave more young Australians locked out of university and higher costs for those who do gain admission. The new funding arrangements will actually be a disincentive for universities to enrol STEM students, as no less than Julie Bishop has pointed out. But I do see some cause for optimism. Take the all-girls robotic team from Blacktown Girls High School and Michelle Rowland's Western Sydney electorate of Greenway. They're winning prizes and international recognition. Those young women are inspiring. The challenge now, though, is to not lose them to institutions overseas. In conclusion, can I say that Labor understands intrinsically the core role of science in improving lives, strengthening our economy and ultimately lifting us up as a nation, making us bigger as a people. We need facts, we need expertise. We can't surrender our fate to gut feeling. We don't have to become that cliche of every disaster movie that starts with a politician ignoring a scientist. The bushfires have reminded us of what happens if we walk away from science. A virus has shown us the path back. What we see in science are some of the greatest peaks of human endeavour. The hunger to know, to understand, to advance. And within those, we see the sources of new industries, new jobs, a new economy, a new resilience. To brighten the future, we not only look to the core ingredients that we've relied on before: imagination, curiosity, respect, and of course investment. Investing in science is investing in our future. Australia can have a better future. Let's create it together. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your speech. I'm really surprised that your observation about Facebook and mushrooms thriving on the same fuel wasn't appreciated. I'm going to pick up on your point on R&D that you made in your speech. At the last election, Labor made a promise for R&D, 3% of GDP by 2030. Is that a principle that you are still committed to, or given the economic circumstances of the times now, that policy is no longer achievable under Labor?
Well, we'll make specific costed policies close to the election. But in terms of the principle of an increase in R&D investment, absolutely. We consider it as just that, an investment, not a cost. It's an investment that produces a return. And if we're better at commercialising our R&D, we would have a growing economy, growing jobs. To use just one example, so much of solar technology that's used around the world was produced right here at the ANU or at the University of New South Wales. What happened then was that it was offshored and other nations got the benefit of those manufacturing jobs, and then we imported it back. We supply all the ingredients that go into a solar panel, but we don't make them here. We used to. I visited the centre at Homebush. I visited a centre in Adelaide run by Origin. We need to be much better at it, and we need to see R&D as an investment.
Okay, journalists, we have a long list of people wanting to ask questions today. Could I please ask that you ask one per person and also stay at the microphone until Mr Albanese's finished giving his answer. Mark Riley.
Thanks, Barbara. Mark Riley from the Seven Network. Mr Albanese, thanks for your address. 10 years to the day since Labor ditched Kevin Rudd, a first-term Prime Minister, 2 ditched Prime Ministers, 3 successive election losses later. Isn't this just recognition that Labor can't win a fight on energy policy, so you concede? And will that pragmatism extend to the big game, climate policy? Will you commit to ambitious medium-term targets towards the 2050 goal and a price on carbon?
Well, what Labor put in place when we were in government was a framework that could be a car, if you like, in which you could speed up by putting your foot on the accelerator or slow down depending upon what the scientific advice was through an emissions trading scheme. The problem now is that there's a debate about fuel and whether you should speed up or go backwards in terms of targets, but there's no vehicle to put the fuel in. And what I'm arguing today, and what the experts have told us that we've consulted with, is that you need a vehicle that has bipartisan support that will be permanent, in place, that can be adjusted, that can be flexible. And that's why we've said the proposals that we've put forward, we're attempting to be cooperative here in putting forward 2 of the suggestions are ones that are the government's, that they themselves walked away from, the Clean Energy Target and the National Energy Guarantee. So what's obvious is that emissions were going down when we were in government. When you had the change of government, that process was reversed. And we've had, since 2013, no energy policy in this country. That's not good for the national economy in terms of jobs, given the recession that we're in, but it's also not good for action on climate change. So I understand that we need to do better as a nation. This is a proposal seeking out bipartisanship on the framework. We can have our disagreements about how much the target should be, and we'll base our targets upon the science. We've already said net zero emissions by 2050. I think it's unfortunate that the federal coalition government haven't embraced that, unlike every single state and territory government, whether they be Labor or coalition.
Price on carbon?
A price on carbon?
Well, we've put forward the mechanisms, and the thing about where we were in 2007, and indeed that policy was written under Kim Beazley, is that renewables at that time needed support in terms of a market-based mechanism. The fact is that the cheapest form of new energy in this country is renewables. It's solar and wind. The circumstances have changed. What is being held back at the moment, and in 2019 we saw a 50% drop in renewable investment. The biggest thing that drove change was the 2020 target, 20% by 2020. I say that I, as the Environment and Climate Change spokesperson, wrote that policy in Kim Beazley's Climate Change Blueprint in 2006. That has been the single most effective mechanism in driving that change. Opposed by the coalition at the time, but it's made an enormous difference. What we need today is a mechanism to drive investment. We're prepared to sit down with the government and work out that framework, go forward in a bipartisan way, because what business tells us is that that would drive massive investment in renewables in particular, and that would drive a significant improvement in job creation at the very time it's needed.
Sorry, does that still mean... Did you get a clear answer on a price on carbon? No.
Well, I've said that the reason why you needed that mechanism was that the circumstances were different. That was about renewables. Renewables today are looking for a different framework. So if you ask, are we going back to the old system, the answer to that is no. We're looking forward, not backwards, and we're looking forward at a mechanism that will drive that change through the economy. And what business tells us, and all the players in the energy sector, is that they can live with a RET, they can live with a clean energy target, they can live with a range of structures. We went to the last election with an emissions intensity scheme. All of those mechanisms are what is required, given the commercialisation that we've seen in renewables.
Stella Todorovic.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you how important a feature of what you're proposing is the ability for a Labor government or an incoming Labor government to upscale future target emissions in the future.
It's essential. It's essential that targets be based upon the science, and it needs to be a mechanism that has that flexibility there. So that we don't argue. I'm not naive about this. I don't argue that the political arguments over climate change, that we can get agreement with the government on it. Because, frankly, there are a whole lot of people there who don't even believe climate change is happening, in spite of what's the facts and the science around them. So what I'm arguing for, though, is that you can agree on a framework, and business say that they'll factor in the potential of changes down the track, but that what they really need is that framework.
Matthew Killoran.
Hi, g'day, Opposition Leader Matt Killoran from the Courier Mail. You've said in the past that you see a future for metallurgical coal in Australia, and that the future for thermal coal is highly dependent on international markets. Given that the ALP's national platform from 2018 largely only mentions coal in the context of just transition and transitioning people out of the industry, what will you do to ensure that coal jobs within the economy are endorsed within the new national platform going forward when the conference meets again in December?
Well, when the conference meets, we'll determine a new platform. But those issues are stating the obvious, that they'll depend upon markets and demand. And I've consistently said that. I maintain that position, whether it's thermal coal or metallurgical coal. The way that all international agreements have been done is to measure emissions at the point in which they're emitted, not in terms of, you don't take Japan and say they produce a lot of cars, so therefore they have to pay the price of the production of those cars. And that's a very simple proposition.
Will you take an active role, though, in ensuring that is endorsed?
I expect that it won't be shocking to say that as Labor leader I will be taking an active role in the development of the Labor platform.
Our next question is from Andrew Probyn.
Mr Albanese, Andrew Probyn from the ABC. You've talked about culture wars and the climate wars. How about the history wars? As Mark Riley was referring to, you've chosen the 10th anniversary of the Rudd coup to make this speech. Energy policy was a big reason for his fall. Do you think there was a sliding doors moment, and you watched this up close, when Kevin Rudd refused to go to a double dissolution in early 2010, given the defeat of the carbon pollution reduction scheme?
History can always be examined, and you don't know what the result of that would have been. Can I say that if there had been a double D dissolution in 2010, I think we would have won. I also think we would have won an election in 2010 at the normal time. The disruption that occurred 10 years ago, and it's just a coincidence that today's speech is after
it's
the
a curious
sitting of
coincidence.
Parliament.
Curious coincidence.
Is that I'm firmly of the view, I stand by my comments on that night. I remain friends with both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, but I think it was an error to remove an elected PM in their first term, and it led to a range of changes of Prime Minister. I said on that night, as I've said on the record, that if this happens, we will damage 2 Labor Prime Ministers, and I think we did. Notwithstanding that, I think that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard both led outstanding Labor governments that made a big difference in terms of reform, and it stands in stark contrast to the occupation of the space that we see from the current government that's been there for 7 years. And at the end of the next election, I suspect part of our spiel that you'll hear from me as you go around the trail will be, what was the point of the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government?
Kieran Gilbert.
Kieran Gilbert, Sky News. Mr Albanese, thanks so much for your speech. I want to ask you whether Labor is still committed to not using the Kyoto carryover credits in order to meet the Paris targets. And if that's the case, do you concede that Australia would then have to double emission reduction efforts over the next decade to achieve that?
To the first question, yes. It's a rort. If it looks like a rort and sounds like a rort, it is. And that's why the rest of the world is saying no to carryover of... I mean, there's some irony, I've got to say, in a government that completely, one, opposed even ratifying Kyoto, and then was opposed to what Labor put in place, saying we want to use those credits of when we had an energy policy in this country in order to make up for the fact that we don't. And what I'm putting forward today is a proposal in which we can have an energy policy in this country. We don't have one at the moment.
Sarah Ison.
Sarah Ison from the West Australian, thank you for your speech. In sitting down with the Prime Minister to develop this national framework, where does WA, the largest resource state, sit in this conversation? Do you think it's inevitable that jobs are going to have to go in the future in this state? And if you were the PM, how would you repair our relationship with China?
Sorry, that was 2 questions. Take your pick.
I'll take the parochial one for WA. This is a pro-WA speech. This is a pro-WA speech. This is a pro-job speech. And a plan for jobs and growth will benefit WA as a resource-rich state. But also, it will be about commercialising the opportunities, some of which is happening already in the West. If you go to in the inner suburbs of Perth, you have a hydrogen exhibition facility, if you like, where they're powering houses, they're examining what can be done by looking and embracing science and new technology. And that at its heart will have significant benefit for WA. WA, along with far north Queensland, is where there are vast deposits of rare earths, including lithium. If we embrace that, if we embrace value-adding and commercialising the opportunities that are there, we should be producing solar panels in WA. We should be producing batteries in WA. We should be making sure that we don't just export minerals, that will remain important, but then import them back once the value add is there and once the jobs are being created offshore. We should be looking at ways in which we can commercialise those opportunities.
Phil Curry.
G'day, Albanese. Phil Curry from the AFR. Just on your speech, and you're talking about the need for a mechanism to drive technological change that can be scaled up in terms of emissions. Wasn't that precisely what the NEG did? And it was the emissions reduction component of that was used by the right wing of the Liberal Party to neck Malcolm Turnbull. So why would you think Scott Morrison is going to embrace a policy that may be different in name but is precisely the same in mechanism?
He said he supported it at the time. He voted for it and advocated for it at the time. Josh Frydenberg saw himself as the architect of it at the time. And they've been in government now for 7 years. People like you, Phil, will not let them go to the next election, I'm sure, saying we've been here for 9 years. If you give us a fourth term, we'll come up with an energy policy. That's really what they're saying at the moment. Give us a fourth term and we'll come up with a policy. We're here to help. We're being constructive. They have listened to the science and that's one of the things that I saw as a breakthrough. They've listened to the science during the pandemic. How about we take that principle onto other measures as well, particularly climate change?
Greg Brown.
Greg Brown from The Australian. Just following up from Phil's question, given how internally divisive any sort of policy framework has been for the coalition involving any form of carbon trading, if you're asking the government to compromise and come to the table on that, wouldn't it make sense for you to would you be willing to consider your own compromise and consider accepting the government's 2030 Paris targets, so Australia has a decade of policy certainty ahead of it, and then the scalability that you talk about can be implemented after 2030?
That sounds like a sneaky two-parter.
Look, we'll establish our own mechanisms based upon the science, not based upon politics. And the science needs to tell us where to go into. That's why the science is telling us net zero emissions by 2050. We're putting forward in detail. The letter to the Prime Minister was respectful. It put forward things that we would agree on and things that we wouldn't. It's the basis of sitting down and then having a discussion. If it can't be worked out, well, so be it. That's up to the government. But the problem for the government is that the coalition have been held back by their internal divisions for so long. And what this is perhaps is an opportunity for the coalition to break up that internal debate, to marginalise those people who say that the science of climate change is, you know, a matter of faith that they don't believe in, just like people who said that the pandemic was because of 5G or because of some other nonsense, that it was dealt with. This is an opportunity for the government. It's put forward in good faith. One of the things that has happened during the pandemic as well is that I think the public have responded well to governments and oppositions across the board federally, not across the board in state and territory governments, it must be said, but being constructive, looking at the science, listening to the experts. I mean, I haven't seen, I don't know if maybe you can answer this, Greg, but I reckon you could do a survey here about who the Chief Medical Officer was for Australia and who the two deputies were 6 months ago, and you would have got, you could have given away a magnum of the best read at the National Press Club if anyone got all three answers. The fact is Australians today know it. How about we listen to the experts, but we're providing the government with an opportunity to sit down. They should take it up.
But you won't negotiate on 2030 targets. You will not. You will not.
Look,
consider
the obsession. One of the things that I'm concerned about is outcomes and directions, and we are prepared to sit down and talk about the mechanisms which are there. We're not the coalition. We'll come up with our own policies and platforms in terms of measures and where we think Australia needs to go, and we'll answer that at the appropriate time in the lead up to the next election. We don't know where the starting point is for 2030. We don't know where we'll be in 2022, as I've explained to you on multiple occasions, and I refer to my previous 73 answers on that question.
But on that question alone, I mean, it's been a long-held position by the coalition to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030. You're not even saying whether you support that now.
Well, that's the government's target. Are they going to meet it? You know, what's the circumstances in 2022? We'll announce our own policies. We've said we support net zero emissions by 2050. It's very clear that what needs to be done, therefore, in between now and then, is the interim targets need to be consistent with that.
Rob Harris.
Rob Harris from the Age and Sydney Morning Herald. Mr Albanese, a number of your shadow cabinet colleagues have called for Dyson Heydon, the former High Court judge, to be stripped of his AC following an independent investigation into his behaviour. Do you support those calls?
Look, I think the most important question here, and my concern, hasn't been focused on Dyson Heydon. It's focused on those brave 6 women, 3 of whom are taking legal action, and to have a debate that hopefully this will facilitate an increased debate about power relationships in the workplace. The idea that a man, a High Court judge in a position of seniority, has engaged in this conduct against people who are in their first job, the best and brightest are the people who get to be associates to High Court judges, should be a huge wake-up call for workplaces throughout the country. Should Dyson Heydon have been given an AC? Well, clearly not at the time, if you look at what Justice Kiefel has found and what she has said. But my concern at this point in time is for the women in this situation. And my concern also is that it's a bit of a call for the nation, I think, to examine workplace harassment, which is always inappropriate, and to look at those power imbalances which are there and ensure that there are mechanisms so that there's recourse. The bravery of these young women to come forward in a circumstance against a very powerful man, a High Court judge, is extraordinary, and my praise to them.
Our next question is from Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Mr Albanese, your energy initiative has been seen by some people as a pivot of Labor policy, but equally it can be regarded as a gesture to the new mood of the community about politics that you were talking about before, a gesture that you know that Scott Morrison is likely to reject. To what extent does this initiative represent any change in Labor policy?
Well, it certainly is consistent with everything I've said as Labor leader. When I became Labor leader on day one, I said that Australians were suffering from conflict fatigue. I said I'd look for solutions, not arguments. And that's what I'm doing here. Looking for a solution, looking for an outcome, not looking for an argument and conflict. Not because it's an academic argument, but there's real-world consequences. Renewable energy investment falling off a cliff by 50% in 2019 as a direct result of the fact that the government doesn't have an energy policy. Now, what I want is a mechanism, and I want it sooner rather than later, I hope, to be in Mr Morrison's position at the end of next year or the beginning of 2022. I want there to be progress before then. I don't want the country to just stagnate in between now and then. That's the spirit in which it's put forward. I must say it's a spirit that I have put forward consistently as the Labor leader, and indeed one that I advocated and put forward in various speeches prior to the 2019 election as well.
And Catherine Murphy.
Mr Albanese, Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia. I'm just asking this question because I've not heard a straight answer to it in the course of this address. Mark Butler said immediately after the election that Labor would set a medium-term target before the next election, which was consistent with the science. Does that remain Labor's policy?
I have said that, and yes, we will set targets based on science.
Brett Mason.
Brett Mason from SBS. Better late than never. In 2018, Malcolm Turnbull said that by-elections are a test of leadership. Eden Monaro heads to the polls on the 4th of July. How big a test is this of your leadership?
This is a huge opportunity for the people of Eden Monaro to send a message to the government. A message about whether they think the lead-up to the bushfire crisis last year was adequate, about whether they think the response and the recovery has been adequate. I noticed Scott Morrison yesterday making an announcement about support for industry, forestry and orchardists yesterday, 10 days before an election is held, and indeed while polling booths are open, they've discovered the industry that was damaged during the catastrophic bushfires needs support. I think it's a test of Mr Morrison. Mr Morrison has circumstances whereby he is considerable boost if you look at the published polls for him. We have coronavirus whereby you have unique circumstances, or perhaps unique in a century, literally, whereby the entire country wants the government to succeed because their health and the economy is up for grabs. They're concerned about it. So the whole economy, the whole country has been cheering on our leaders, whether they be federal or state. But the test and the opportunity that's there in this by-election is for people to send a message about the bushfires and what occurred there, about as well JobKeeper and all those people who've missed out, the million casuals, the arts and entertainment workers, the people at Donata, whether also it's acceptable that the government has the new economic figures about the state of the economy. They know it's now 95 days until JobKeeper is withdrawn. If they don't want JobKeeper to be withdrawn, vote against the coalition on Saturday, July 4, because at the moment the government has those economic figures, and guess what? They're not telling you until after July 4. That's not a coincidence, that's a strategy to rip out support for people who need it, who are vulnerable, but not tell them until after the by-election is held. And that's why people should cast a vote for Kristy McBain. She's the outstanding candidate. She's the only person as well who, I'll get a chance for an ad here, the only person who their party wanted. The truth is that the Libs and Nats were too busy fighting each other within and fighting against that went on for weeks, which is why the by-election was delayed. Kristy McBain was our first choice. She's the best choice for Eden Monaro.
We're close to time. Are you happy to take a few more questions?